All right, it's the Husk, unfiltered voices in our age of digital narcissism and, I don't know, other things. I'm trying to find a new, I used to call it unfiltered radio, but we're not on the radio, so I'm trying to find a new thing, but that's not it. On the show today, we've got Tora Colwill, who is funeral director the right term, Tora?
You can say funeral director, yeah.
Because I'm snidey and sneaky, I was on LinkedIn and it said Undertaker.
Undertaker.
That's really cool, isn't it?
Yeah, well, very near this. At the beginning of my career, I much favoured Undertaker because of the sort of connotation of undertaking, like people's wish, doing the job for them. Funeral director was too pompous.
Yeah, it's a bit dry as well, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't want to kind of. Yeah, I want to be there to facilitate and support something in the background.
Now, so you're working with death anyway, and we've met at one of our shared friends' soirees. I think that was a fair thing to say. And we had a sort of semi-drunken conversation quite a long time ago now, and it was just before I'd started making this show. And I always thought to myself, I definitely want to get you on the show. And what happened was, I didn't want to get you on straight away because I was like learning what I was doing and all this kind of stuff. And then bloody COVID came along.
Yeah,
and then the show collapsed and my mind collapsed and we couldn't have anyone in the house and this, that and the other. And loads of stuff happened. But now we're back and we've got you here. So I'm very happy that you're here because we wanted you on the show for a long time. That's the dog coming in, but that's okay. Right, so let's start with this. How it doesn't seem like an obvious career trajectory. How on earth did you get into this role?
So how I got into this job in the first place, I think that we've probably got a tendency to write our own narrative, so you can write the story of your life, and I take it back quite early on because in terms of the meaning of me doing this job. So I remember going to my granddad's funeral and being really upset, stiffly buttoned up in my school uniform, craning my neck as the curtains were drawn. It was a cremation, to sort of see if I could see his coffin for as long as possible, and being completely confused.
How old were you at this time?
I was 9, and I remember that because I was sad he wasn't going to see me in double figures.
Right.
So I was like nearly 10, and he just missed seeing me in double figures. So I was really confused, and the adults in my life were really upset, and nobody spoke to me directly or made much sense. I mean, they were so upset themselves, so I don't think that's not quite the time to get philosophical with it, I suppose. So I kind of take it back to that moment. I thought, who are those strangers, suited up themselves? Who are those strangers, and who gave them the right to be closer to my person than I am?
Okay.
So I definitely thought that something was going on that I wanted to understand better.
Okay.
And maybe to deconstruct a little bit. I don't know.
And was there anything prior to that in your life that sort of might have been leading you this way?
I don't think so. I think that I can't really think of anything earlier than 9. But then sort of after that, I suppose there's all the gothiness and the music and, all of the sort of graveyard obsessions and things that happen in your teenage years. And then I suppose that I could see this kind of death positivity as being some sort of progression of 90s gothdom.
Right, yeah.
But in a way, I suppose, like I've gone pro now.
Yeah. You're full-time goth.
Full-time. So I think that there are those things. Yeah. Well, it's easier, isn't it? Because I'm always prepared. I'm always ready.
You're always ready.
But I was working at the Duke of York. So I was working at the cinema, the art house cinema, and I did that through my 20s. Loved it. It was like working at Empire Records, and it was great. But I think around when I was turning 30, I wanted to do something a bit more meaningful. And a lot of the staff, we'd known each other for a really long time by then. And I think it was a really slow Sunday that we were killing time, just like, I might check out what coffin I would like if I was designing my own funeral. And we just started Googling and realised how little there was out there. And, how kind of conventional all of the options were. So that inspired me to kind of do a little bit of reading I read the Good Funeral Guide. I started going to a couple of exhibitions. And I think one of the staff members had just said, why don't you be a funeral director? Like, that would really suit you. That job would really suit you.
Right.
So they were people that I'd worked with that knew me. So it very, very naturally happened. And actually the person who said that, I've ended up supporting that person through funerals of their parents and stuff. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And presumably there's some sort of qualification you need to do or training?
There isn't, bizarrely.
Really?
So that's kind of an interesting thing that I discovered at the start of my investigation, is that you have national bodies, so the NAFD, or bodies of independent funeral directors, but there's no legal requirement in this country to even employ a funeral director when you're putting together a funeral.
Right.
So that in a way is good, because it means that ownership of the dead is in the family's hands. In some states in America, you have to employ a funeral home. So that kind of removes you from the situation a little bit more. And it appeals to me to support those kind of self-help, DIY, direct it yourself, like those types of families.
Yeah.
I think that's very cool if you've got a little bit of nous, and you know, I really think that being involved practically, in whatever way you can be, can really help the healing process.
So how did you start working for somebody, or you just went straight into independent?
First of all, I went to, you know, one of these kind of funeral exhibitions in a woodland burial ground, I think in Epping Forest or something. Found the author of the Good Funeral Guide and said, I really want to get involved in this industry somehow. Tell me where to start. And he said, go and be brave with the bodies.
Right.
And then go and sort of understand the ceremony. So, you know, those two elements, that just check that you're comfortable around dead people, I suppose, is one element of it. And then he really pushed me towards becoming a celebrant, I suppose. So understanding don't love that word, but understanding that sort of funeral speaker role, how you would write and present a funeral. So and that's kind of the celebrant role can be some of the emotional labour. That might be the role that the priest does, you know, or in a secular way, it might be a celebrant. So I paid an enormous amount of money to kind of do I think it was like a 10-day residential training for a celebrant job. It was something like £6,000 or something.
Right.
So I was important to me to get that qualification. And then I did some work experience at some funeral directors in London. So I kind of went in and saw the more practical behind the scenes.
Yeah. And how did you
stuff
when you first started actually dealing with the bodies?
Yeah.
How did you find that was that? Did you take to that really quickly, or?
I did actually. I did get quite comfortable quite quickly. You have some odd dreams at the beginning. I think when your subconscious is kind of catching up with yourself and processing. I really think now that the way out is through with this stuff, and that if we all normalised death, then we're kind of putting ourselves in a stronger position for when these things inevitably do happen around us or to us, you know.
I want to come back to that idea about death and culture and where we're at with that. But first of all, we need to get down to the nitty gritty. So you see a lot of dead bodies. Now, some of them must be in quite a state. Injured and things like this. What's the kind of I think you said to me last time that you're involved in sort of dressing the body and making it look. Can you talk us through a little bit of that?
Well, I mean, I don't know how gnarly you kind of want me
gnarly
to be.
as you want me.
As
You've
quite
got no
open
rules.
about it.
Let's go for it.
I remember. So when I was doing the work experience at the beginning,
tell us the gross stuff. That's what we want.
One of the first bodies, and it's sad too, you know, so one of the first bodies was a woman in her kind of late middle age, but she'd hung herself.
Right.
So, and there was an implication in that, in terms of that there were things that we needed to clean, and I really wanted to make sure that she was as clean as we possibly could get her.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just remember, you know, not being satisfied until we were at a kind of certain point.
Right.
But that was quite an early on, and I think the guy that was helping me was a firefighter. But and this was way pre-COVID times, but we only had like one mask, and he got the mask.
Right, okay.
And so I just kind of rolled my sleeves up and got on with it. Yeah, as the new, like the new girl just kind of did that. Yeah. So I do think that it feels like a kind of, some kind of sacred space, or you just want to do your best for that that person can't do anything for themselves anymore. Yeah. So you just want to care as much as you can for them, for their families.
Now, a lot of people start off in work, especially sort of work that they're really passionate about, and they do feel very, very passionate and very engaged with it, and then people become desensitized, and it becomes very difficult to keep this level of sort of focus going. Have you found that yourself, or not?
I'd certainly say I'm more comfortable around bodies and things now. You know, there's just different. They just feel different at different times. You learn a lot about the story, that I suppose what the body's saying to you about what's happened to it, or what time. You know, you kind of pick up some of those things. But my reverence for it hasn't sort of faltered. I wouldn't want to become,
complacent.
You know, you still do talk to people, if you kind of have them in the car for a trip, or that, and it always feels quite poignant in that moment just before, as you put the lid on the coffin, or so, so it's the last time that anyone will see their face. As often it's us that are seeing that for the last time.
Some people do say obviously funerals are for the living, not the dead. You obviously have to deal with people at their most grief-stricken, most broken. How is that? People must be very angry, very irrational. How do you find
grief
that?
is all the emotions in any order, no sort of prescriptive way of doing it. I have core philosophies that I try and keep on the tip of my tongue. So no judgment at all, and not to make assumptions, which can be really, really, really difficult. But even as an assumption as simple as calling the dead person a loved one. I know that's, of course, we hope that person was loved, and we hope that there's love in the family situation, but you just can't tell. And you don't know, it may well fall on the lap of somebody who's been abused by a parent who then arranged that funeral. So if you're using those words that assume a relationship, then that can be really hurtful and make something even more difficult and painful. So I feel like there's a real kindness in being as straightforward as you can be.
And presumably as well, because in our lives we sort of socialise with people that are in our own sort of circle in some way. But you must come across all sorts of families from all different walks of life all the time.
I love that about the job, that I have no idea who's phoning me up, and they can be from all. And I'm quite proud of the fact that however we've kind of created the website, or the language that we've used, appeals to such a broad range of people. That was the intention. And
this is the modern funeral we should mention here. We'll put some links up, and we'll show the website when we do the YouTube stuff. So this is your company. How long have you been involved in the modern funeral for?
I think it's 8 years now. I think it's 8 years since I kind of set it up with the £1 company's house thing.
Okay, right.
So I think it's about 8 years. I think
now
maybe a little bit younger.
Let me ask you this: society, the infrastructure of society, the infrastructure of this city and many cities is under a tremendous pressure. Pressure for more housing, more schools, more hospitals, more jobs, more cafes. Is there a pressure for more funeral places, directors?
Well, that there's the Sussex Resilience Forum, so they've been meeting with crematorium staff, with the technicians at the mortuary, at the coroner's mortuary, throughout the pandemic, and they've always been there to prepare for example, they had to respond to the Shoreham air crash disaster in a very particular way. But they have set up additional temporary mortuary facilities at the Sussex campus. So we were using that at the start of this year. Okay, that's like a new thing, and we just received an email actually this week that there's the extramural chapel, which is in the grounds of Woodvale Crematorium, and that's not going to be open for services at least until March next year, because that's going to be operating as additional mortuary facility as well. So there's definitely been a need to try and take the pressure off the NHS as much as possible, so to quickly kind of, if lots of people are dying in hospital, to make sure that there's somewhere interim that they can stay whilst the paperwork's organised and the families work out which funeral director they want. You know, it definitely happened at the start of this year. There's a WhatsApp group for local independent funeral directors, and never before, but at this year we were sort of, you know, working out who was the busiest, who could maybe take on an extra job, and those of us reach capacity. You know, I'm running a really small operation. There's a kind of practical capacity of there only being so many days in the week, but then there's the emotional labour capacity as well. And at some points this year, you know, we found ourselves supporting 6 to 8 families at a time.
So you've personally been running much more funerals
because
of COVID recently.
Yeah, more funerals.
Now we try.
And not all COVID deaths though, like some secondary things, but just more. Definitely more noticing that more was going around.
Now we do on this show, for the sake of my mental health, try not to talk about COVID too much, but I think it's unavoidable. It's unavoidable in this context. So apart from sort of being under increased stress, it must be just a difficult time generally. Obviously, there's been limits on how many people can go to funerals. How has it affected you? How have you managed to cope with it?
Just like, you know, the first, you know, COVID meant my first experience of kind of, you know, saying no to stuff, or because we always would just want to say you're limited by your imagination and let's get creative and just make things work that people want to do. And it was tricky because although obviously there were restrictions on numbers, it felt a little bit like we had to kind of be a bit of a middle person and just filter that information and try and keep people safe as well. So, and it's. And
how did families how did families take to this? Were they fairly?
They have
okay?
been really understanding, and there have been lessons learned in a positive way as well that I will take forwards, which. And one of the most kind of the thing that really stays with me is where numbers were getting limited, lots of people chose to just keep it really nearest and dearest. So just because you kind of can draw a line around that, really the sort of family unit quite easily. So nearest and dearest invited, and then something kind of special happened at some, you know, bearing witness to some of those moments. Some of, you know, in the room, people were quite clearly not on show, so they're not worried about what they're wearing, you know, and it was so natural. I witnessed kind of children just standing up, able to speak to the coffin, people speaking to each other, you know, like an intimacy in that space that was created by not having loads of people there. So, and that's something that I really want to carry forwards. So in the future, I'm kind of thinking, how can you make that work? And I think you could offer the day before the funeral, like afternoon into evening, you could offer for the immediate family to kind of gather to see the coffin for the first time, to maybe see the flowers, so that when it gets to funeral day, they're then presenting, you know, and that it's because it always the moment, isn't it, when you see the coffin for the first time, it's kind of like things get real. And
this is a thing that used to happen, right, where you go and visit them in the chapel or whatever. Or
so you can still do that. I'm kind of thinking of, and it's like an Irish wake thing, isn't it, really, that people would have a drink around the person in their coffin ahead of their funeral. Like that, you know, the wake was before the actual funeral.
Now, you were talking earlier about death in our culture and saying it's not something we talk about. Now, obviously, we're living in a very, you might say, youth-obsessed culture. a culture sort of obsessed with staying alive, staying young, staying healthy, but I think staying healthy in the young way rather than any sort of sustainable way. Is this a problem because we're living in basically a secular society, or is it something else? What are your thoughts on it all? I don't
think it's because of a sort of lack of religion per se, but and it's tricky because language fails us. I don't know, getting a bit more as I get older, I kind of tend more towards the sort of nature-based faiths, I suppose, and that's brilliant because each year the seasons that teaches us of the entire cycle of life. So I think I've got.
Are you talking sort of paganism and
paganism, sort of that type of thing? Just any sort of nature-based faith in that way, I think can teach us a lot. And I think that death's obviously within that cycle. Yeah. But I think death can teach us a lot, itself. It's the instigator of our creativity. You can't have children if you don't die. There's all sorts of kind of profound things that we might learn, to make the most of stuff if we get a little bit more comfortable with it.
So you're thinking that it's a sort of spiritual connection to nature which is missing, which doesn't have to be religious. It can just be in some other way. Yeah,
I think the funeral, again, to bring that sort of like non-judgmental thing in, we can create funeral services that do a nod to different religions, and just bringing different groups of people together with their varying beliefs and things. But the key things are kind of for the funeral to be really, really personal, about what's the point of a life, and what's the meaning of a life. Like those are the things that you really, really want to draw out, because that's what the group want to share, because you're kind of, the funeral is that time where you're separating the body from, the meaning of the life, I suppose.
How do we get our culture to embrace death a little bit more, bring it as part of our culture? How are we going to do that? It sounds really difficult when we're all just like watching Netflix.
I know, but there's so much death, isn't there, in all the things that we watch, so many of the things that we watch. I sort of have an eye on that with the culture that we're just absorbing all the time. Like there's so much death in it.
So we're sort of obsessed with death.
You're sort of obsessed with it, but not really kind of like just getting comfy with it and understanding it and making friends with it, you know.
We're terrified of it.
Yeah, so using it for sort of cheap thrills and all that type of business. Do
you think about your own death? Have you prepared a will and
things?
I
do have. I've got a document that people know where it is.
Yeah. I can spell my name later.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think hopefully with my funeral I've tried to think about the experience of the people that are left behind, but I think there's an argument that it it takes a lifetime to learn how to die. Yeah. And I do think about my own death. I sort of do these trying to prepare things, right? Because it just it feels like when I remember being a kid and finding out that you die and that your mum dies and everyone dies, and just being so blown away by that. But it just felt like this dark cloud of how am I ever going to get my head around that? And I think that for me, I don't know if it's the same for everyone, but for me definitely the way out is through, and the thing to do is get more comfortable with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about your own beliefs? What do you think happens when we die?
I'm not very good at that question, at the what happens when you die question. I think that it's beyond what I could fathom with my conscious mind as this being in this reality.
Can I ask you, is that a professionally crafted answer?
No.
Or do you have a sort of a secret thing that maybe you don't feel would be appropriate to say publicly, which would be fair enough?
No, that's kind of where I'm at with my faith experience, I suppose. So I practiced a Japanese form of Buddhism when I from sort of 19 to mid-20s. I'd studied Buddhism before that. I took acid when I was a teenager, and that mind bend, and all of these things, without them being in my experience, I doubt I'd be doing what I'm doing now. So yeah, the kind of can't fathom it beyond with this conscious mind is kind of genuinely how I think about it.
Fair enough. Have you, just going back to the times when you've been working with dead bodies, have you ever been like spooked out? Have you ever thought there might be a ghost, or has anything scary ever happened, or are you not too bothered?
I have found I'm like less scared of ghosts after doing it. But this is the whole thing. This is the acclimatizing thing again.
Yeah.
Like I used to get way more scared putting the fire chains on the Duke of York's than I do walking into a mortuary with like 100 fridges.
Yeah.
There have been like, nuts moments that really kind of like level everything.
Right.
Like, I remember being at a mortuary in Chelsea and being shown where they'd put Princess Diana when she'd been in a fridge. So that's kind of a weird, like a levelling thing, but not spooky.
Sometimes bodies sort of make random noises, right?
They can. Yeah, that can happen.
Yeah.
That can happen. That can be kind of gas working its way past your vocal cords the other way.
Right.
Sort of out. Well, yeah. Escaping out and setting off your vocal cords.
Wow.
So there can be little rumbles. Other bizarre things, I was kind of thinking this earlier, like it's the physicality of it that you kind of have to get used to. And I remember picking somebody up on a really cold, like snowy evening. So going into a care home to pick up a dead person there and realising that they were ever such a lot warmer than I was.
Right.
So, because you would always just think, a dead person's colder than me. Yeah. But it's like these things aren't necessarily true. There's just a physicality to it.
Yeah. Now you're working. We're recording this show in Brighton. You're working. Yeah. You work in Woodvale quite a lot. Is that right? Which is, I'm always surprised. There's a lot of people I meet who have lived here for a very long time and they've never even been to Woodvale. And it's such a beautiful part of the city. It's probably the most, I think, even if you're a tourist, it's worth going to, right?
Totally.
And if you want to make a goth music video, there's no better place.
There's your location. Yeah, it's, I mean, I love it. There's lots of different cemeteries. So there's really good walks. You can get lost and you know how it is. You can't necessarily see. You just get lost.
Yeah,
quite
they
easily.
have like a crypt walk, and there's very, very overgrown, very old areas. There's more modern areas. It's very long. It's a green lung of the city as well.
There's so many interesting graves there as well. There's like opposite the extra mural. Have you seen the one with all the gold mosaics?
Yeah, I think so.
Inside,
yeah.
There's actually a light bulb with electricity plugged into the chapel.
Right.
So that can actually be like turned on from the inside.
Okay.
Which
amazing.
Is like an amazing thing. But I love that space. And I love just kind of, you understand Brighton because you understand like what different areas are on what hills.
Yeah.
And then further out, like the different deans and stuff. And I quite like that that's the kind of Death Hill.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. It's absolutely huge, isn't it?
That's like an enormous kind of Death Hill.
And there's another couple of areas around that as well, isn't there?
Well, there's the Downs cremation. It's like it's an enormous area, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's been designated.
Yeah, and there's one over the road. I don't know what that one's called.
There's the extra. Yeah.
Yeah, crazy. Yeah. Amazing. And we were talking on the show last week with superfan Dave. We were talking about. Briefly talking. I say talking, we just mentioned him. We were talking about Alistair Crowley, and he was cremated there, wasn't he?
He was, indeed.
Pretty crazy.
He was cremated there. There was a little bit of uproar from what I heard from the public who didn't they kind of force the council to consecrate the chapel after, because it should be a non-denominational chapel.
Yeah.
But I don't think they liked the satanic
Allegedly satanic.
Well, have you read The Funeral that he wrote for himself?
No.
There's a naughty thing that I know.
Oh, go on.
So after the uproar, everyone
we're getting into it now, listeners. Here we go.
Yeah, everyone was like, oh, we shouldn't, that particular ritual shouldn't be allowed to be performed at the crematorium. To kind of get around this, I did a funeral for an OTO member, and who was a friend of mine, and we in the extramural chapel we actually had an OTO representative who recreated Crowley's funeral
Amazing.
For us.
Wow.
So, like, I got to witness that actually happening.
The OTO folks was an organisation that he set up, a sort of secret occult membership kind of thing.
Yeah. So I have to say I was mildly disappointed with the actual content of the funeral. What we did for our friend was brilliant. It was an amazing day that suited him and was exactly what he wanted. But I felt like Crowley's funeral was kind of existed within the constraints of a conventional funeral, like more than I would have. Yeah. I would have wanted something a little bit more out the box if it was me.
So what are the plans for your funeral, Tora? what are we going to have? Sort of sequins falling from the trees? I don't know.
I wouldn't mind. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't mind. I wouldn't mind a kind of evening time natural burial.
Right.
But yeah, kind of lanterns in the trees and very freeform.
Yeah.
Just, you know, some music being played, but people just being able to, like, speak when they want to, and nothing too formal at all for me.
Lots of red wine.
Yeah, just they can just drink and listen to music and just do what they will. But I do like the idea of it not being a normal time of day.
Yeah.
So that you can kind of slip into the night.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Funerals are very formal, aren't they? They're a very formal arrangement for a lot of people.
Yeah. And we obviously provide that kind of professional service where all the things are covered. If you don't want to do it, if you don't want to get involved, then we'll cover everything.
Yeah.
And do the lot.
Now, riddle me this, Tora.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't know the answer to this, but there must be quite a lot of people in the world who have no family and no money. They're absolutely broke and they die. What do we do with them?
Unfortunately, I think it's still called like a pauper's funeral.
Right.
But there is a fund that will cover the cost of, so that the council will kind of cover the cost of people's funerals.
And presumably you don't do that work. They have a council
it tends
minimum
to go
wage.
out for tender, like
Right.
the contract for doing them.
Okay.
And so there'll be one funeral director at the moment who's doing that. But there's not ever such a lot of flexibility in there in terms of, you know, you kind of just get the funeral that you're given then.
Yeah. So everybody has a funeral, no matter what happens.
You don't have to have a funeral. You can choose not to have a funeral as well.
Right.
So, and that's kind of on the rise more and more. This kind of, in a way, sort of separating the practical from the ceremonial. So this sort of direct cremation idea, or this, you know, total no fuss idea.
Yeah.
That happens quite a lot. So that you may well have nobody bearing witness on the day that you're cremated.
Okay.
But people might just get the ashes back, and then you can do something, you know, there's lots of things you can do with ashes, like into firework rockets, or, you know, I've had families mix the ashes with paint and paint a picture. You know, you can do creative that keep them, scatter them, you know. And that's a kind of low cost way of transcending that conveyor belt type funeral that people don't necessarily want anymore. But I do think that there's, you know, even though you might not like funerals, and it's completely sensible to not like funerals, that they still serve a function, and that there's a point to them, and that difficult though they may be, if we all try and gather together and support each other and make sense of something that's happened, you know, that there's a value in them. So I think we should be careful of just, you know, sidestepping it too easily.
Most people now cremated. Is that just a practical financial consideration?
Yeah, in this country, it's a lot now, isn't it? It's about 75% or something like this. So that's it. Kind of, it makes sense practically in terms of that there's not loads of infinite space for burial grounds. Yeah. You know, like burials started in churches, and then when the churches got too full, they like spread to graveyards, and then graveyards that are completely separate from churches started. Yeah. And it just doesn't make practically loads of sense. You know, even a grave is like a rented space. Yeah. You have a lease on it, you know, after a certain amount of time, you know, they can just get moved along, and you see that often. You know, if you really know what you're looking for, you can sort of see where graves have been moved along.
Interesting.
I like the kind of natural burial idea because of that, because the graveyard itself becomes like a monument to like somewhere that you can go and walk around that's beautiful and back to nature. I think that's good.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in future methods of body disposal, so like alkaline hydrolysis, which is water cremation, which
is that just being melted in acid? Is that what you're talking about?
It's like so it's an alkaline solution, pressurized to like 15 atmospheres in a kind of tank thing.
Yeah.
And so instead of if being cremated is not very green.
No.
It the mercury abatement systems and things that they have in the crematorium are great now. It's good that they're trying to do something with it, but the whole process still creates toxic waste.
Yeah.
It's not great. There's these barrels that they pick up from the crematorium.
Really?
With this like black viscous, like, don't know, weird. So I think that there's got to be ways that if we don't want our body to just be buried and stay whole, that we can treat our body in a different way.
Yeah.
Either through composting, that's being invented in Seattle, so like quick composting of the body, or this alkaline hydrolysis, because it makes a sort of black nutritious liquid because you haven't burnt your body, so you're not releasing all the nasties. It's actually something that could be a really great fertilizer. So
wow,
that makes more sense to me, that we might go in that direction of something different. Do
you obviously you've got hopes and wishes for the future of funerals. You'd like them to be more diverse. You'd like them to not be so rigid. You're interested in different ways that people might dispose of the body, for want of a better word. Do you think we'll actually, and maybe you would like some sort of death to become a little bit, or our culture to become a little bit more settled and comfortable with death? Those are the things that you'd like. Do you think that is likely to happen, or are you very concerned that we're just going to drift further and further away?
I've noted in the work that I do, I think people do understand some of these options a bit more now. And like people reference David Bowie's funeral often. He had a direct cremation in New York for like $700 and a beach scattering in Bali, and he's always been a little bit ahead of the game. And I think just such a massive popular culture figure like David doing that has kind of meant that there's all the kind of boomers that have loved him. Some of them, I think that these things have an impact. And I think that people are becoming more aware of their choices, and obviously and because there are personal funerals happening around the country now, that aren't necessarily just a cut and paste liturgy of something. So, and then the more people that experience those, I'm really hopeful that I would love to see a change in my lifetime, but I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to achieve that.
And just coming towards the end, it's all about the nitty gritty. Life's all about numbers. How much is it going to cost me if I die?
Well, that's a really good point. What do you want? What do you want? Do you want a cremation? Do you want a burial?
The thing is, I'd always wanted to be buried, but I don't think it's going to be realistic by the time. Who knows when I'll die? But
I mean, you can secure your plot now. But burials,
I'd quite
more
like
expensive.
a little axe and a mobile phone as well, just in case.
Yeah. Oh my God! Did you see? There was a comedy. There was a real burial in Ireland recently, and the bloke had recorded himself. He was a bit of a joker,
right?
And he'd recorded himself, and the funeral directors were kind of in on it, so they lowered his coffin into the ground, and then you just heard. Hello, and then he started speaking, and that was really funny and good.
Love it.
But essentially, obviously I can do you mates rates, depends when it happens.
Mates rates,
but
love
it. We can do a full-on cremation for around £3,000,
right?
Whereas the average is probably 4.5 around this area at the moment.
Yeah.
Burial might be more like 5, something like that, but.
Right.
it totally depends.
Can you still get buried at Woodvale? Is that even possible?
Well, the Woodvale are using the
extra bit,
the Wooding Dean. So
oh, okay.
It's really nice there. They have like a little woodlandy bit. So if you go up, I mean, it's weather dependent. There's no chapel up there.
Yeah.
But you can see the downs and the sea, and it's a bit lovely. But that's where Woodvale there's a law memorial and a woodland site up there.
Amazing.
But yeah, if you're concerned about keeping costs down of your funeral, I've got some
discounts.
Helpful. Yeah, I've got funeral
Deadly
planning
discounts.
on a budget kind of tips and stuff. And if you choose what you want and give people jobs, then you can really get the cost down.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Dying on the cheap.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well,
I like just the one last thing, because
I
just think it should be about the human experience and not about buying stuff. That's what I really think.
The humanity of it.
It's the human experience of the thing, and it shouldn't just be shopping for £1,000 worth of flowers.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
I mean, even now it's also just a day, right? It's one day.
Yeah.
But I think in the past these things probably were drawn out a lot longer.
Yeah, I don't know. I think sometimes people are dragging out between when the day that somebody dies and when the funeral. I think that's getting longer and longer.
Oh, really?
Because people don't just kind of tend to their dead now.
Right.
They're just like, oh, well, I've got that holiday. But and if we could just, it's kind of a bit more like that now.
Is it?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I think it would be good if we just took it seriously.
Okay. What are your plans for the future? You're going to carry on in this work, presumably. You've got all these ambitions.
Carry on in this work. Yeah. My sort of near dream is to set up a funeral centre that can offer information and offer all the facilities that people need to make a funeral happen. And future goals are to be involved in practically modernising how we deal with our dead.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Now, just one more little thing, because I did notice online while I was stalking you, there's this thing called the Death Café. Is that still going?
Yeah,
what
it's
can you tell me
still
about
going.
That?
John Underwood, who set up Death Café, actually died himself.
Right.
Which was quite sad. He was quite a kind of pivotal person in the sort of alternative funeral group in this country. So that was really a sad thing. Death cafes still go on.
Okay. And what is it?
They're just a safe space for people to come and talk about death. So just to help people acclimatise. I've made quite a lot of kind of gingerbread coffins for death cafes before and had quite amazing chats. So there was, for example, that one death cafe I held, I think it was in Lewis, an 84-year-old woman drove from Littlehampton, so from quite far down the coast, and she just said, that her children refused to talk to her about her sort of imminent demise, and she just wanted to get it off her chest. She was like, I've lived a life, it's been full, it's been fantastic, and I'm done. Right. And I just want to kind of say that. Yeah. So death cafes can be interesting chats, and I think it's healthy to have those spaces.
Well,
but it's not like I haven't got all the answers.
Yeah.
It's just about creating these kind of spaces and facilitating people finding out what they want to do.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show, Tora. It's a really interesting thing, and it is definitely something we don't talk about very much. And like I say, I've wanted you on the show for a long time. If you are listening, then and you're around Brighton, and if you're dead, you can go to themodernfuneral.com. We'll put a link up, and the Death Cafe will put a link up for that. Coming up on the show in the future, well, I've got somebody called Sabina who is releasing a book about plant pots and mental health. So that's coming up, and hopefully somebody that is a legal advocate for uncontacted tribes. So that sounds quite interesting.
That's awesome.
That's not guaranteed yet, but that's on the list. And we've got a life coach that we've had on before. She's going to be on, I think, next week. So we've got some interesting shows coming up. I have to, because I get complaints, and I think one of the complaints I'm going to get is I have to tell people to hit subscribe and all that kind of stuff. So do that if you're listening. And thanks for coming on the show, Tora.
Thank you. It's, thanks for joining in the important conversation.
It's been great to have you on. Maybe we'll get you on again when you've got your death centre open.
Yeah, cool.